The Empire of Callias is the largest nation on the continent. In this land with a long history, there is an equally old but terrifying tale. Deep in the dark woods live ferocious monsters. Adults used to scare children with stories that if they cheated, a scary monster would come after them. Of course, the scary monsters are still fiction after all. People often mentioned it while raising their children and did not believe in the existence of monsters. To the north of the Callias Empire was the Camus Forest. The knights in this forest lit a large bonfire, which they used to burn the shell and reach the great magic stone. This magic stone was shown to the young lord, whereupon he said he would leave the rest to the knights, got on his horse and rode away. The family of the Duchy of Hickarel were the only people who knew about the existence of monsters. This family had defended the empire for many years and were powerful people that even the imperial family recognized. Behind the sturdy walls was a secret that no one could even imagine, a power tied to their destiny, sealed by an oath kept for 1,000 years. Hickarel had the blood of a demon hunter in his veins. In particular, Aslan, the eldest son of the duchy, had particularly inherited the power of his ancestors. At the age of 14, he was already an unrivaled demon hunter. Since childhood, Aslan had always suffered from an inexplicable feeling of frustration after hunting. At times like this, he always wandered into the forest. It was exactly the same that day. Deep in the forest of Camus, Aslan encountered an unexpected creature. Contrary to the guy's expectations, it was not a monster, but a human. A young girl with blonde hair who was picking berries. After 5 years, the blonde-haired girl was riding in a carriage and remembered the words that she should try hard, because this opportunity for her is like a luxury. The girl was asked not to forget the favor she had been given. The protagonist, of course, thought that one day she would be sold under the guise of being given in marriage, but she did not expect it to be so sudden, because of a man whose face she did not even know. There were rumors that the man who would marry Lady Roel was a cripple. It was Mr. Hickarel, a sickly man covered in burns. All the men of the duchy were monsters. It was rumored that they were even vampires. The knight who rode in the carriage with the protagonist told her that the lands of the Duchy of Hickarel started from here. The girl looked sadly out the window and thanked him for the information. People often said that traders who traveled through the Camus forest disappeared. The exact reasons for the disappearance were never known, even though it had happened many times. It was said that there really were monsters there. The protagonist was scared, because this is the forest of Camus, and now she is riding in its very depths. Suddenly, the carriage stopped abruptly. The knight told the girl not to go outside under any circumstances. The protagonist thought about the fact that it could be an attack by a mountain beast. She closed her eyes and ears out of fear. Suddenly, someone's hand gently touched the girl's face. The girl opened her eyes and saw a dark-haired guy with red eyes in front of her, who called her by name. The stranger introduced himself and said his name was Aslan de Hickarel. Roel felt herself losing consciousness. The girl's eyes closed against her will. When the protagonist came to her senses, the same knight who had accompanied her was sitting in front of her and said that the carriage had been attacked by a mountain beast, and there would have been great trouble if it had not been for the young lord who had been there in time. The girl asked, "Not about Aslan de Hickarel," says the knight. He confirmed that it was about him, and it was fortunate that the young gentleman, along with the duke, happened to be nearby. The protagonist recalled that Aslan did not seem to be ugly or crippled. The girl tried to understand what had happened and asked the knight where the young gentleman was now. The knight replied that they had gone to deal with the remaining beasts. The protagonist had almost arrived at her destination. Already, the castle of the Duchy of Hickarel could be seen from afar. Roel was surprised that there are such big, wide houses. The girl heard someone's feminine cry. The knight told her that it was Madame's voice, and it seemed she was now training knights. Madame was shouting to the knights to concentrate, otherwise they will run 100 laps. Turning her head, she saw that a carriage had pulled up to the manor and came closer. Stepping out of the carriage, Roel stumbled on a step and started to fall. The protagonist was picked up by Madame, who was already nearby, and did not let her fall. The girl thanked for the help. The madame's face was clearly displeased. She assumed that the girl was a new servant, but one of the servants explained that it was the Viscount's daughter, Roel Lintea. The woman examined the girl carefully. She couldn't believe she was so small and young. Madame was furious and said that even for her son, it was too much. After that, the woman calmed down a little and ordered the servants to bring this girl to a normal appearance. The protagonist was brought to a beautiful bathroom. There, the maids undressed and bathed the girl and also tidied up her hair. Roelle looked in the mirror. It seemed to her that in the reflection, she sees a completely different person. A man coughed behind the protagonist. She turned and saw the butler. He introduced himself and asked to call him Dimitri. The girl was very worried and asked what would happen to her next. Roelle said that the Duchess did not like her. The butler replied that Madame was worried because the girl was very thin. Dimitri said that although it was a little late, he would welcome Madame to the Duchess of Hickerel's castle. Roelle was given a tour of the estate and shown where the servants' rooms, banquet hall, kitchen, and storage were. The girl thought to herself that if she wanted to get to work soon, she would have to memorize well where the kitchen and the storehouse were. The butler turned around, saw the look on the girl's face, and said that she was too tired and he was talking too much. Dimitri offered to escort the girl to her room. Roelle couldn't believe that this place was now her room. Everything around was very beautiful and chic. She couldn't believe that she would live in such a luxurious place, and even the Viscountess had never been in such chambers. The protagonist suspected that something was going wrong. She pinched herself and made sure it wasn't a dream. The Duchess appeared and called the girl by name. Roelle bowed and said she was honored to meet the Duchess of Hickerel. The madam asked the protagonist to answer honestly and clarified if she was really 16 years old. The girl confirmed and thought about the fact that the Viscountess might have lied about her age. The Duchess took Roelle's face with her palms and said that she was very small and skinny and asked if the girl wanted to eat. Madame called for the butler and ordered him to feed Roelle something. A great variety of dishes were placed in front of the protagonist. The Duchess asked if there was a dish that the girl could not eat. In the Lintia mansion where Roelle used to live, eating nothing and starving all day was a common thing. The protagonist thought it was amazing that she could even eat so luxuriously. After tasting the first spoonful of soup, the expression on the girl's face changed a lot, and the Duchess asked what was wrong. Roelle replied that it was the first time she had ever eaten something so delicious. With a snap of her fingers, the Duchess called the servants and told them to bring another bowl of mushroom soup, and then told them to bring the whole pot at once. The protagonist ate heartily. The evening came. The maid led the protagonist to her room and wished her a good rest. The girl closed the door, sat on the bed, took her stomach, realizing that she was very full. It had been a very long time since Roelle had eaten like this. She had been offered a taste of literally every dish on this estate and was surprised that the girl had had enough of such a small amount of food. The Duchess was shocked that it was possible to be satiated with only a small portion. The protagonist decided that next time she would have to try to eat a little more. The girl ran her fingers over the bed. It was soft, and even the sheets appeared airy. For almost a few years, the protagonist slept on straw bedding, and one day when the girl was cleaning up the Viscountess's room and accidentally fell asleep, seeing this, she was severely punished and beaten. Roelle could not believe that she left this mansion. The protagonist was worried that when she woke up, it would all turn out to be just a dream. She considered it lucky that she hadn't been kicked out yet and assumed that if she did something wrong, she would be kicked out of here immediately. Roelle decided, despite the Duchess being kind to her, to show from tomorrow that she could be of use. The girl moved from the bed to a small couch where she seemed more comfortable and fell asleep. Waking up, the protagonist was terrified because the sun was already high in the sky. The girl was angry at herself for oversleeping and being too relaxed. She started to clean the bedroom and make the bed, and at that moment, the Duchess entered. Madame asked the girl what she was doing. Roelle was very upset and apologized for waking up too late. The Duchess laughed and said that there was no such thing, and she woke up just in time. Madame patted the protagonist on the head and said that they needed to get ready for their walk, as there was a lot to do today. The woman talked about shopping. The protagonist, along with the Duchess, went to the town of Catium. There they entered one of the stores, where the employees kindly greeted the Duchess. She explained that she had come to buy a dress for the little lady and pointed to Roelle. The Duchess explained that she had information that the lady of the Viscountry was 16 and had prepared clothes for that age. but it seemed she would have to buy everything new. The employees of the boutique encircled the protagonist in order to take measurements. The girl tried on different images. Madame said she was buying it all. One of the dresses the main character was offered to put on and go in it. The workers looked at the Duchess and Roel and said that since they were wearing similar dresses, they looked like sisters. Madame asked the girl if she liked her reflection in the mirror. Roel replied that the clothes were very pretty. The Duchess said that the girl was beautiful, not the clothes. The Duchess thought that the clothes were too small and asked the girl not to worry because next week she would personally call a designer from the capital. The woman warned the protagonist that they still had a lot of shopping to do. The madam carried the protagonist several boxes of jewelry and said that it was a welcome gift from her. Roel felt that she couldn't accept such expensive things. She didn't know how to respond properly and thought maybe she should say that she liked it, but it was too expensive. The Duchess shouted furiously at the butler, asking if there was anything else better. The protagonist said that was fine. She liked everything very much. The packages and boxes the girl handed to the butler, who carried it all behind her. Roel recalled that she used to do this job. The madam took the protagonist under her arm and happily said that she had not walked with anyone like this for a long time. The woman also heard about the girl being attacked on the way to their place. The protagonist replied that everything was fine and the knights were diligently protecting her. And the young lord had also come to her aid. The Duchess looked at the girl gently and told her not to worry, for Aslan had gone to destroy the remaining beasts. She reassured the girl and said that the monsters didn't really appear that often. Madame asked Roel what she knew about the Duchy of Hickarel. The girl apologized and said that she wasn't as educated, so she didn't know much. The Duchess replied that it was not about her, but about the duchy itself. The protagonist asked the madam why she said that. The Duchess answered the girl that she would soon find out everything herself and told her that her husband and son would soon return. After that, the woman offered to have lunch and said that there was a delicious restaurant nearby. The rumors about the Hickarel family wandering the land were only negative, but it was only the second day of her stay in the duchy. The protagonist began to suspect that most of the rumors were false. Mr. Hickarel, who saved the protagonist yesterday, was kind, though he looked harsh. People called the Duchess an ice knight without blood and tears, but Roel, for the first time in her life, met such a merciful and kind person. In the duchy, the protagonist was not tormented at all, treated as if it was all a dream, as if it were her own daughter. The girl rejected these thoughts and believed that she should know her place. The main character dropped a coin. It rolled under the table to the men who were sitting and drinking alcohol. One of the men covered the coin with his foot and started laughing when he saw the girl trying to retrieve it. The protagonist asked to remove her foot, but the man pretended not to hear anything. It was valuable money that Roel had been given by the Duchess. The stranger grabbed the girl's arm, and she screamed in pain. Seeing everything that was happening, the Duchess came over and grabbed the man by the hand he was holding the girl with. The stranger asked the woman who she was, but Madame only twisted his arm harder. The Duchess introduced herself and said her name was Serena de Hickarel. She glared furiously at the man and asked what he was doing and how dare he. The madam threw the man to the floor with all her might. The two men who were with the brute ran up to him to drag him to a safer place. The protagonist covered her mouth with her hands in horror. The Duchess took a concerned look at the girl and asked if she was badly frightened. Serena reassured Roel and said that everything was fine and she was safe now. The girl realized that from now on she must never hurt the Duchess. Serena noticed that the girl's wrist was swollen and needed to return soon to heal it. The protagonist was thankful for the help. The Duchess thought she should have killed those people in the first place. After that day, the protagonist's life was so amazing, like a dream that was impossible to wake up from. First, the girl had a dressing room, and there everything was hung with luxurious clothes that she had never seen until now. Roel's face was noticeably rounded, although the girl thought she was eating so much that there was no room left in her stomach. Nevertheless, the Duchess was worried that she was eating too little. The main character once had indigestion because she ate too much. But it was impossible to forget the face of the frightened Duchess. The girl also tried to speak more simply. At first, it was very awkward, but all the staff on the contrary told the girl that they were uncomfortable when they were spoken to respectfully. Roel's life now included good food and walks, and finally the girl was beginning to get used to a quiet life. However, in troubled times, she would sneak out to clean, but she was constantly caught doing it. The maids were horrified that the protagonist was taking away their work. One of the maids once again took away the broom from the protagonist and suggested that she go look at the training ground. The maid led the girl to the place where the knights were practicing. The protagonist was told that these were the knights of the duchy, and most of them had followed along with His Excellency and the young master, with only a small number remaining in the castle. Upon seeing Roel, the knights bowed respectfully and greeted the lady. The girl's cheeks reddened with embarrassment, and she greeted them back. The knights all gathered together and looked at the protagonist with wide eyes. The girl was hiding behind the maid's skirt from embarrassment, and the knights said that they were honored to meet the mistress in person. They also said they counted on her support, and it was a great honor. Sir Kaplan, the commander of the Sirens' Night Squad, intervened in the conversation. He called his subordinates idiots and explained that they were only scaring the lady with their shouts. The knights began to bow again and apologized to Roel. The girl replied that everything was fine and she was just frightened by the loud noises. Kaplan turned to the protagonist and asked if she had looked around the castle. Roel silently wondered. The commander said that it was the second training ground and the place where His Excellency the Duke usually trained. He also said that there were many knights in the duchy's castle with strength equal to the emperor's. The Duke and Duchess had knight units separately. Roel turned her head and saw a small blonde-haired boy hiding behind a pillar. She wanted to point at him with her hand, but he immediately disappeared somewhere, and at that moment the bell rang. Kaplan asked the protagonist not to worry and told her that this sound warned of the return of the Duke and the young gentleman. The girl went to meet them. Roel was standing next to Serena when the gates opened, and many knights on horseback and carrying flags entered. The staff was congratulating the Duke and the young lord on their return. The protagonist saw a fair-haired man with red eyes and realized that that man was Duke Hickerel, and he was exactly like the statue seen in the center of the capital. It was rumored that the Duke and Duchess's faces hadn't changed in 10 years, and so they weren't human, but vampires. A young gentleman also got off his horse and called Roel by name, looking her in the eyes. He sat down on his knee in front of the girl and asked if her mother had ever hurt her. The girl replied that it was all right, and Madame had been very kind to her. The Duchess stood nearby and told her son that he was saying some absurd things, and while he was away, she and the girl were having a very good time together, even going on a shopping trip. Herzog came up to the main character and looked at her closely. Apparently, he was shocked that Roel was so small. The girl greeted the Duke and introduced herself. The father angrily grabbed Aslan and called him an unscrupulous boy who had allowed himself the impermissible. The Duchess stepped closer and pleaded with her husband not to kill her son. At that moment, a servant came up to Roel to take the girl to her room. Serena noticed that the number of knights had increased. She approached Aslan and told him that she had heard that Roel's carriage had been attacked by mountain beasts. The boy remained silent in response. His mom was well aware that this was a guy who wouldn't wiggle an eyebrow even if the world collapsed right now. Besides, it seemed that Roel didn't know Aslan. A few months ago, Aslan had come to his parents with a conversation. Serena thought it was very strange that her son, who rarely opened his mouth, came to talk to her, but he also came with a request. Aslan told his parents that he wanted to get married. The Duke and Duchess were shocked and asked whom their son wanted to marry. Aslan gave the name of Roel Lintea from the family of Viscount Lintea. The Duchess resented that her son used to refuse when marriage proposals came in and wanted to understand what had changed. Serena said she had never even heard of a family like the Linteas. The Duke told his son that he forbade him to marry. Aslan made a loud statement, but the expression on his face didn't even change. The boy sat on his knees without hesitation and repeated that he wanted to be betrothed to Lady Lintea and asked for permission. Aslan knelt down without hesitation, but his tone was still close to that of just notifying his parents of his decision. Nevertheless, it was a shock to the Duchess that Aslan knelt for questions about the marriage. Eventually, in exchange for the marriage license, the parents put one condition on the lad. The condition was to hunt down all those who had recently gone on rampage in the border area. Seeing their son obediently obeying the order, the parents once again went into shock. Usually such a hunt would take at least 3 months, but after 1 month, he had already proudly returned to the duchy. Serena couldn't have imagined even in her dreams that Lady Lintia was so Yuna. The Duchess looked after her son and tried to understand what was going on. The protagonist at this moment was sitting in her room and thinking that His Excellency the Duke was very angry and believed that he didn't like her at all. Roel was worried that she might be kicked out because the Duke didn't like her. The girl took out a notebook that was wrapped in some kind of cloth. She thought about her mother and what would happen if the Duke found out that she was the adopted daughter of the Viscountess Lintea. The reaction could be very different. The butler entered the room and the girl was a little startled, hiding the journal she held in her hands. The man told the lady that His Excellency the Duke was calling for his office. Roel was startled by these words. The butler escorted the protagonist to the Duke's study and notified him that Mrs. Roel was already here. When the girl entered the study, the man told her to pass through and take a seat. There were many treats on the table. The Duke asked the girl to make herself comfortable. She was so embarrassed that it was even difficult for her to drink the tea. The man asked the protagonist if she was really 16 years old. When Roel confirmed that she was 16, the Duke slapped his hand on the table and said that he thought it was necessary to cut off his son's hands. The man told the girl that she could be honest with him and asked if Aslan had threatened her. The protagonist was shocked and replied that nothing of the sort had happened. The Duke suggested that, in that case, his son might have tried to convince the girl with money. The Duke asked Roel to listen to him carefully and said that this place, the Duchy of Hickorel, and it is very dangerous. It is not at all a place that is suitable for a little fragile girl. Roel clutched the hem of her dress with her hands and said she would try harder. She cried and begged not to be sent back. The Duke was horrified and said there was no need to cry. At that moment, Aslan burst into his father's study. He was furious and asked his father what he had done to Roel. The Duke replied that it wasn't him at all that made the girl cry. The young gentleman sat down next to the protagonist. The father asked Aslan why he had come if he was not invited here. The boy replied that he should be here anyway. The Duke pounded his fist on the table again. It was already hard for the protagonist to talk to the Duke. Now the young lord imposed, and she did not know how to be. But looking at Aslan, she realized that he was really beautiful. The girl thought that the rumors that his face was covered with burns were spread because of envy. The father asked Aslan if he knew that Roel was such a small 16-year-old girl. The son replied that he did know. The Duke pounded his fist on the table again and called Aslan shameless. The father was very angry and said that the son could not say that he wanted to get married. Looking at this little girl the size of a pea, Aslan said in a calm, measured tone that he wanted to get married. The Duke was shocked that even knowing the girl's age, he wanted to get married. If the man had known earlier that it would come out like this, he would have refused his son as soon as he said about marriage. Based on these words, the protagonist realized that the young master was the first to talk about marriage. The father grabbed his head with his hand and told his son that, in any case, he might not dream of marriage until Roel was of age. The Duke also told the protagonist that he had ordered his assistant to hire a tutor, but was now notifying her. Roel was very surprised when she heard about the tutor. The Duke smiled and told the girl that she could go back to her room and take a break. The protagonist bowed in return and thanked him. Aslan stood up with the girl, but his father reminded him that he hadn't let him go, and they weren't done talking yet. The son replied that he would escort Lady Roel to her room and return. Aslan walked ahead, and the protagonist followed him. She looked carefully around and saw a beautiful garden that was full of flowers. The young gentleman, noticing the girl's reaction, offered her a walk. The protagonist reminded that he needed to return to the study as soon as possible and finish talking to his father, but the guy replied that it was nothing. The girl realized that the Duke would not be happy about it at all, but, nevertheless, agreed to the walk. Roel and Aslan strolled through the garden. The girl thanked him for saving her life last time and thought she was a little late in thanking him. The young lord replied that everything was fine and asked if there had been any inconveniences while in the duchy. Roel replied that there had been no inconvenience thanks to the great care taken by the Duchess. Aslan was glad to hear that. The protagonist admitted that she actually had something to ask and wondered why he had decided to betroth her. Aslan looked at the girl carefully with his red eyes and answered that it was all to fulfill a promise, but now not only for that reason. Aslan touched the protagonist's face with his palm and then sat down on his knee and said that here he wanted to make a formal marriage proposal. He asked the girl if she would marry him when she became of age. Suddenly, the little boy whom Roel had seen that day behind the pillar came running out of the garden. He shouted that he was against marriage and would never recognize it. After that, the boy ran away again. Aslan asked him not to pay attention to him. The protagonist realized that given that the young gentleman says not to pay attention to him, so this reaction was due to his immaturity. The protagonist tried to understand why this little boy was constantly angry, as if he sensed injustice. Aslan told Roel that she had a younger brother. The girl confirmed this. She said that they didn't get along very well and weren't on close terms at all. Initially, there was no relationship between them. Unlike the protagonist, who was adopted, this boy was the native son of the Viscountess. Sergei never directly abused the girl and never even talked thickly. Aslan noticed the girl's hesitation and asked if everything was all right. The young gentleman reminded her that he still hadn't heard an answer to his proposal and asked if she would become his wife when she was of age. The girl blushed, bowed, and said that of course she agreed to marry. Aslan smiled and said he would escort her to her room. The young gentleman admitted that it would be wonderful if Roel smiled more often. 5 years ago, when Aslan was hunting in a dark forest, he met Roel and couldn't understand why a human would be in such a dangerous place. Then she offered him some berries she had picked and said she wanted to share. When Aslan sat down to the girl, he told her that it was very dangerous to be alone in this forest. At that moment, 4 monsters that could take the form of humans came out of the thicket of the forest. They asked what people were doing here. Aslan covered the girl with his hand and drew his sword. These were high-level monsters. They were extremely surprised by the presence of humans. After all, it was quite easy to tear a human to pieces. But the boy wasn't scared at all when he saw them. They thought that the boy would make a great toy and rush to attack. Aslan defended himself. The main character watched the battle. She realized that it was insanely difficult to face 4 high-level monsters at once. Despite Aslan's best efforts, the monsters easily tossed him aside and approached the girl. One of the monsters grabbed the main character by the throat and said that she had finally fallen into their hands. At this point, the monster was killed by the main character's dad, after which the rest of the monsters decided to retreat. The father sat down to the girl and apologized for being late. He promised that everything would be all right, because Papa had come. Aslan came to his senses and saw Roel hugging a man he assumed that the man might be the girl's father, and then the boy lost consciousness. His wounds were quite serious. When Aslan woke up again, he was lying on the bed. His wounds were treated and a happy protagonist was standing next to him. She was glad that the boy was awake. The girl ran away from the room to inform her mother. Roel lived in a cabin, in the woods with her parents. Aslan stayed there while his wounds healed. The protagonist's father often looked at the boy with wariness, but said nothing. One day, Roel ran to Aslan to give him a wreath. The girl confessed that she had made it with her own hands, especially for him. The boy smiled and said that the girl gave him something all the time. Aslan bent down so that the protagonist could put the wreath on him. Though the whole thing lasted less than a month, these were the most peaceful days in Aslan's life, until the day the red moon rose. Everything was on fire, and Aslan ran to his parents to tell them everything. From that moment, he searched for the main character, putting everything he had on the line as there was a chance that she was still alive. Hiding his identity and pretending to be a mercenary, Aslan went to the battlefield filled with the smell of blood, but could not find news of Roel and her family. When Aslan saw the girl in the carriage, he realized that she had been living horribly in the Viscountcy all this time. She fainted from fright, and Aslan carried her to another carriage in his arms. For the first time in 5 years, the fellow felt alive again. Aslan kissed the hand of the main character who was lying unconscious and promised that now he would protect her. The guy cannot allow to lose this girl for the second time. A servant knocked on the protagonist's bedroom and told her that they had a visitor to see her. This was the day she was to meet the teacher that the Duke had chosen, and today was the day of the first lesson. The protagonist was nervous and worried that if she made a mistake, the Duke's reputation could be ruined. Roel could only read and write, and learned everything else by observation. But earlier, the Duchess had learned from the girl how she had studied at Viscount Lynthea. The protagonist could not say that she was not taught anything there. The servant asked Roel not to worry and assured the girl that she would definitely become an outstanding student. The protagonist realized that she should try her best so that she would not be ashamed. The butler introduced the teacher for the girl. It was Countess Cobelian. Roel greeted her teacher and introduced herself. They sat down across from each other. This countess is one of those who have a firm grip on the secular world. In order to make a successful debut in high society, it is said that one must make a good showing in front of the countess. Viscountess Lynthea, in order to show herself in a good light before the countess, constantly sent her letters and gifts, but no response. When all the expensive gifts were returned, the Viscountess immediately became furious, and in the end, all the anger she took out on Roel. The countess turned to the girl and asked if she had studied etiquette properly. The protagonist replied that she could read and write, and the rest she had learned only a little through observation of others. The girl was worried that the countess would just leave, even though the duke was trying very hard. The girl apologized and promised to study hard. The countess told Roel to repeat after her. The first thing to do was to straighten her back. Then the woman suggested that it was necessary to smile slightly, but the eyes should be indifferently lowered. The protagonist again began to apologize in advance if she suddenly made or would make some mistake. The countess asked how the girl was going to survive in such a hard world. The teacher explained to the protagonist that right now she looked like a sick chicken that was shivering and about to fall if anyone touched it. The girl was apologizing again. Roel didn't understand what she should do so that Madame would no longer be angry with her. Still, the etiquette the girl was learning through simple observation was not enough. Roel again apologized if her shortcomings were an inconvenience. She promised to try very hard if she was taught and asked to be given a chance. The countess stood up, walked over to the girl and took her hands. She asked Roel to raise her head and confessed that she herself had scared the little girl without realizing it. The countess admitted that just now, by her behavior, she was imitating the Duchess. Serena is very strict in many things, and no matter what anyone says, she does not care. The main character relaxed a bit and laughed as they continued to talk about how the Duchess looked. The countess was telling the girl that she should learn to be just as brazen. Roel was surprised, for it wasn't even etiquette and knowledge that needed to be learned, but insolence. The countess explained that etiquette and knowledge should be based on self-confidence. She explained that if the girl was not self-confident, then any words and actions would be like a flower without fragrance, and there were quite a few scary and dangerous people in the world. The countess said that in this duchy, there are at least 3 dangerous people, and there are many others who seem good on the outside, but are essentially evil on the inside, and in order not to be defeated, one must become stronger. Roel said that the Duke, Duchess, and young Mr. Aslan are very good people, kind and soft-hearted. The girl confessed that she did not know how to repay them for their kindness. The countess told the girl the romantic love story of the Duke and the Duchess, and told of Siren's exploits at the girls' academy. Then the clock struck, and it was time to return. The teacher asked the protagonist not to worry, and promised that she would now go straight to the villa, pack her bags, and come back. The countess told the protagonist to prepare herself properly, and the next lesson would not be as idle as today. The girl bowed and thanked her for the lesson. She promised that she would try hard and asked her to take care of her. The countess asked to call her teacher from now on, and the girl gladly agreed. She smiled broadly and sincerely at the countess. As the teacher rode in the carriage, she thought about this girl and how sweet she was. When the countess received the letter from Serena, she thought for a very long time, because even if it was a request from an old friend, noble ladies at that age are quite stubborn and proud. Teaching a 16-year-old girl is very exhausting. Correcting improperly learned etiquette is much more difficult than teaching new etiquette, but Roel turned out to be quite different. The countess tried to understand how such a young maiden was able to get into the Duchy of Hickaril, and how come. The countess realized that the people of this duchy did not belong to the category of ordinary people. There were many things that were not quite clear. The teacher hoped that her ward would not receive mental wounds and was determined to protect the girl. And when the protagonist returned to her bedroom, She remembered the words of the Countess asking her to call her teacher. The girl was glad that, having arrived in the duchy, she meets only good people: the Duke, the Duchess, and even the servants. Everyone around her was surprisingly nice, and even young Mr. Hickerel. A butler knocked on Roel's bedroom. She allowed him to enter. Dennis told her that there would be a dinner party tonight in the annex. Naturally, the protagonist was also invited, for it was a family dinner to welcome her. The girl was very excited to have a real family dinner. The Viscountess, the foster mother of the protagonist, and her son drank tea and talked about how peaceful it was when that rat Roel was out of sight. The boy thought still that it was somehow unusual. It seemed strange that the duchy had offered this wench marriage. The Duchy of Hickerel, also called the Northern Empire, it was surprising that they were sending a letter to their family. The woman said that the reasons were not important, and the fact that they agreed to take this worthless wench maddeningly, gladly, it was left to put aside unnecessary excitement. The Viscountess felt that all they needed to think about was what help they could get from their family member. Luna Lintea is the Viscountess's amazing younger sister, who was born into a noble family but loved to roam the woods. Mama Roel hated her since she was a little girl, because all the parental love went to her. Luna always talked nonsense about wanting to see the big world. The girl was very happy when her sister left one letter and ran away from home. However, 5 years ago, she came to her in a sickly state, and Luna felt sorry for her. Although the Viscountess felt no affection for the child, who was very much like Luna, the sister passed away some time later and left the Viscountess all her property. There was also a request in the will to take care of Roel. It was the bank, to which the Viscountess went without any expectations, but the safe was filled with rare, expensive jewelry and paintings. Thus, the protagonist was adopted, though in the beginning they just wanted to kick her out. Wealth, which left Luna, little by little ended, and then marriage with the Duke of Hickerel, who is not inferior to the imperial family. The woman considered it a great fortune and payment for the fact that they looked after and fed the girl. The Viscountess's sons said that if they borrowed the Hickerel family's strength, they could easily advance. The woman said that she had given the girl instruction before she left, so she would obey her well and send them more money from the duchy. It was time for the dinner party. The main character was being looked after by the servants. They brushed her hair and picked out her clothes. That blue dress suited Roel very well, but she was still uncomfortable wearing such luxurious clothes. The door to the protagonist's bedroom opened, and she was announced that a young master had come for her. The girl turned her head and saw Aslan standing in the doorway. He told her that the dinner party was needed to welcome Roel to the family. Aslan wanted to escort the main character and asked her permission to do so. He extended his hand to the girl, and she reciprocated. They held hands and headed to the banquet hall. When Roel arrived, she was pleasantly surprised at what she saw around her. The Duke and Duchess in fancy outfits were already greeting the children. The Duke was telling the protagonist to come closer, and the Duchess was complimenting the girl's dress. The protagonist was offered a chair to sit on, but Aslan moved another chair and asked her to sit next to him. There were tense looks between the Duke and his son. The Duchess decided to diffuse the situation a bit and told Roel to take a seat next to her. There was one empty chair at this table that was meant for the younger boy. The protagonist now realized that this boy was not a servant, but the youngest son of the Hickerel family. The Duchess asked her son George to say hello to Lady Roel. The protagonist was introduced to the youngest son of George de Hickerel. The girl greeted the boy cheerfully, but his gaze was fierce and ferocious. Georgie turned his head to the side and said he did not wish to dine together. Aslan turned to his younger brother and asked what these antics were. The brothers looked at each other carefully. Georgie had been less than respectful to Roel, and Aslan clearly replied that she shouldn't be called that, and that was it. The protagonist watched what was happening and realized that they had to be stopped. Aslan said that Roel was his future bride. The Duchess told her youngest son that if he didn't want to be left without dinner, he should sit down at the table sooner rather than later. In front of the protagonist was a huge number of different dishes, which she happily gobbled. Aslan carefully watched the girl and smiled slightly. To him, this girl seemed incredibly cute. The Duke turned to the protagonist and asked how the first lesson with the Countess went. The girl smiled happily and said that she enjoyed it all very much and thanked the Duke. Serena smiled and said that the girl also came to the Countess's liking. The Milo family chatted around the table, all smiling and looking happy. Roel watched his new family and realized that, like this, having dinner together, these people in the duchy liked to eat tightly. Now the protagonist it was clear why on the first day the Duchess was worried about how much the girl was eating. Roel assumed that the cook here must also be a hardy enough person to work in the duchy. Roel placed the utensils on the table, thanking her family for dinner. The Duke asked in surprise if the girl was already full. The answer was yes, but the man thought she had only eaten a little. Aslan looked at his future bride and asked if she always ate so little. The girl replied that she was used to eating little. She thought about how when she lived in the Viscountcy, she often had to go hungry. The Duchess looked at her family and asked them not to force Roel to overeat just in case, and told them that on the first day the girl had indigestion due to overeating. However, now she was eating quite well. Aslan told the protagonist that after dinner she could go for a walk and everything would digest well. The girl took the utensils and said she would eat some more. The family looked at Roel with joy. The protagonist began to be offered a variety of dishes and was told that some of them were made especially by request. Seeing Georgie's angry look, the Roel held out a roasted duck for him to look at. The boy looked away and told the girl to eat it herself. The main character smiled affectionately and suggested that Dahlia eat together, whereupon the boy cut off a piece of the duck. The Duchess had tears in her eyes, and she did not understand how such a child, who looked like an angel, got into their house. The Duke also found this situation very cute and said that if he were Roel, he would have already thrown that goosefoot in his face. In his study, the Duke was reading a letter from Roel's foster mother. In the letter, the woman addressed her daughter and said that it was about a week since her stay in the duchy. It said that the mother was disappointed because there had been no word from her daughter. The Viscountess told in the letter that because of her marriage, she had to take care of a lot of things, so the family's situation had worsened. The woman in the letter blamed the girl for forgetting the family she had left. It also mentioned a request not to forget the words that were spoken before leaving. The butler Denis told the Duke that he had ordered people to inquire about it, and it turned out that the girl had been mistreated at the Viscountcy. The Duke pondered about Roel and remembered a conversation with his wife, who said she was worried about the amount of food Roel was consuming. But there was an even more serious thing. When the Duchess came out to listen to the maids who had bathed the girl, they said there were numerous bruises on Roel's body. According to the doctor's report, there were no serious injuries, but she had received few beneficial ingredients and seemed to have been abused for a long time. The Duke also remembered the girl's tears when she first came to his office and begged him not to send her back. The butler looked at the Duke carefully and asked what they would do next. The man angrily squeezed the letter and said that first they needed to get the opinion of the girl's fiancé and told him to call Aslan. When the main character's fiancé came to his father's study, he learned that a letter had arrived from the Viscounty of Lintia. The Duke let his son read the letter. The lad snatched it furiously from his hands. The father looked at Aslan carefully and thought he was a very strange fellow. Usually if you called him, he wouldn't even come. When it came to Roel, he immediately jumped in. The guy scrutinized the letter carefully. The Duke asked her son if he knew about the way the girl was treated at home and the fact that she was physically abused. Aslan's answer was in the affirmative, just as his father had intended. The boy was about to leave, but the father asked if his desire to marry the Roel was motivated by pity. The lad stopped and replied that he had received a request from Lady Roel's father. Viscount Lintea had died many years ago. The Duke did not think it was his request. There was only speculation about how the girl was treated at home, but the fact that they were not the biological parents was surprising. Yes, and Aslan was not the type of person who would kneel before someone to fulfill someone's request. The Duke wondered how long his son had known the girl and what had happened back then. He asked Aslan who Roel's birth father was. His son was silent in response, and his father had to shout to get any kind of response. Aslan asked his father not to touch the family that raised Roel. He said he would deal with them personally with his own hands. The Duke also told his son that a messenger from the imperial family had visited the mansion this morning. The emperor had invited Aslan and Roel to a banquet. The Duke looked at his son and reminded him of his own words that he could handle everything himself. The man asked his son to prove it to him. Aslan seemed willing to do anything. The protagonist had a lesson with the Countess, who told her that an envoy from the imperial palace had arrived. It became known that Roel was invited to a banquet at the imperial palace in 2 weeks. The girl heard about it for the first time and was quite frightened. The Countess explained that there was nothing surprising in this, for she was the bride of the young Lord Hickarel. On a normal day, the young lord would have declined the invitation. But since the Emperor's personal messenger had come, he couldn't refuse. Roel was horrified at the mere word that she was a bride, and it seemed that the imperial family was very interested in the girl. The teacher told the protagonist that, in any case, she needed to be prepared. It turned out that the girl had never studied social dancing, etiquette at a banquet. It seemed to Roel that if this continued, the name of the duchy family would be dishonored. But she didn't know what to do. The teacher affectionately placed a hand on the girl's shoulder and told her not to worry. The Countess told her that from today, they would begin a special training. Emperor Vincenzo sat in his palace of Kalios. He was talking to the crown prince, who was talking about the emperor sending a letter to the duchy of Hickarel. Vincenzo was sure that although he had sent a letter, it was obvious that a refusal might follow. The prince stood up and asked the emperor why he was so gracious to the Hickarel family, for even though it is a ducal family, it seems that they take the emperor's orders too lightly. The emperor replied to Nicholas that he would understand in time. Vincenzo once disapproved of the duchy of Hickarel, as did Nicholas, but there are reasons why the imperial palace has drawn up the duchy in peace. The mystery of Hickarel, kept for hundreds of years. When the emperor heard this from the previous emperor, he was in great shock. It wasn't the imperial family showing mercy at all, and someday the emperor would tell Nicholas about it. The emperor asked the crown prince if he wasn't curious who the bride of young Mr. Hickarel was. Nicholas said it was rumored to be the lady of the Viscountcy of Lintea. Young Mr. Hickarel, having come of age, dismissed all talk of marriage. But one day, strange rumors began to circulate. The gossip was started by Viscountess Lintea herself, who loudly boasted that she was related to the family of the Duchy of Hickarel. Nicholas thought about it and realized that he had never even heard of this Lintea family. The crown prince reflected that there must really be something special about this lady. The emperor said that when they met, everything would become clear. The protagonist walked through the manor and sighed heavily. Yesterday, until late in the evening, the countess had given a special training. It was a lesson in how nobles should move, a lesson in what manners should be. The teacher had said that if one studied this, one wouldn't have to worry much. The protagonist had mastered most of the basics, but she still lacked knowledge about the nobles of the capital. The girl felt that she needed to study even more before the afternoon class. Roel went to the library and looked for a book about the noble families of the Kalios Empire. The girl didn't see that little George was lurking nearby, telling the protagonist that she was now also sneaking around and reading her brother's books. The boy looked angrily at Roel and shouted that she should stop acting so brazenly and told her that his brother was having a hard time because of her. Roel was horrified to hear that she was the cause of any trouble. The protagonist recalled that when Aslan had delivered the news of the invitation to the imperial banquet, he had looked quite worried. The girl admitted that she knew nothing and apologized. Dahlia continued to shout and said it made no difference and told the girl to return to her home quickly. Roel felt horrible and could only keep silent in response. The boy ran away and snagged a pile of books that was on the table. At this moment, the protagonist ran up and covered Georgie with her, and he looked at the girl in rage and asked what she was doing. Roel looked affectionately at the boy and said how good it was that he didn't hurt himself. Georgie couldn't believe that now this unskilled fool was setting herself up under the books for him. He was angry because he didn't think he was weak enough to hurt himself over books. The main character was still worried that the boy might have hurt himself and crawled closer to him, but he pushed the girl away and ran away. Roel thought about it and realized that such a reaction was quite normal. The main character was used to getting hate in the Viscountcy, and coming here, she was used to only good things. The girl's musings were interrupted by Aslan, who entered the library. Roel did not expect to see her fiancé now and apologized for making a mess. Aslan gave the protagonist a hand and asked if she had bumped anywhere. The girl replied that she was fine and now she would clean up all the fallen books. The guy ordered to leave everything as it was, as there was already a butler nearby who was ready to clean it all up. Aslan put his hand on his heart and looked the girl in the eyes and said that today was a very nice day and suggested to go for a walk. Roel smiled and happily agreed. The weather was really beautiful. It was the first time the protagonist was in the place Aslan had brought her to. She was incredibly curious about where they were going. The guy opened a low wooden gate, and the protagonist entered some path, which was located behind the ducal castle. They continued the path and came directly to the lake, which had an unusual purple color. Roel, not hiding her amazement, rather ran up to the lake and asked how it could be such a color. Aslan narrated that the reason why the lake was purple was because of the underwater plants at the bottom. Aslan took off his shirt, clearly going to swim in the body of water. Roel, seeing the body of her future fiancé, blushed. The guy said that he would be back soon, and the girl stayed waiting for him on the shore. The protagonist shouted to the young gentleman a question about what he was going to do. Aslan said she was wondering what plants looked like in the water, and he could show her now. Roel shouted that she wasn't interested at all, whereupon the guy turned around and put on his shirt. The protagonist looked carefully at the lake and realized that although it couldn't be like this, it felt as if she had been here before. The girl decided to ask Aslan if this lake had a name. The young gentleman answered that it had a name, but now it needed a new name and offered the main character to come up with one. The girl was very surprised, for she was not even the mistress of this lake. Aslan said that it was not true she was the mistress. Roel looked at the young master in bewilderment and asked if he was going to give the lake to her. Aslan replied that he did not mean that. The girl laughed and said that he had funny jokes. It was not a lie or a joke because the mistress of this lake is indeed Roel. Maybe not right now, but after a few years she will be. Aslan saw some glowing eyes in the bushes and realized that the monster had managed to get even here. He covered the girl with his hand and prepared to draw his sword. Roel was startled. Suddenly, a small animal light in color ran out of the bushes and jumped into the girl's arms and started licking her. Aslan said that it was better to let the animal go because it could be dangerous. The protagonist did not understand how it could be dangerous because it was so small and cute. It was a small dog that looked viciously at Aslan and growled. Roel found a wound on this puppy's body and assumed that it had hurt itself and had gotten behind its mom. The girl turned to Aslan and asked if this animal could be taken to the castle and treated. The eyes of the protagonist were full of hope. Aslan nodded positively in response. The animal was taken to the castle, where it was examined by a doctor who told her that it seemed to have hit something sharp, and thankfully, the wound was not deep. The girl hugged the puppy tightly and thought that he must have been in a lot of pain. The door to the doctor's office swung open, and the Duke and Duchess entered, weapons in hand. They were surprised to see Lady Roel there. The Duke and his wife hid their swords behind their backs. They looked closely at the animal and didn't understand what was even going on here. It wasn't just a dog or a puppy, but a special monster at the top of the food chain. The intelligence and magical power of this creature is at a high level. It looks like a wolf and could be the size of a large carriage. Most likely, it has now taken the form of a puppy with the help of magic. Generally, these creatures very rarely leave the central part of the Karmouche forest, and they are proud monsters with a noble character that are hard to control by the Hickerel family. The Duke and Duchess were shocked as they watched this monster lick Lady Roel. The parents demanded an explanation from Aslan about what happened here. The protagonist stood up for the young lord and said that he was not guilty of anything, and she herself wanted to bring him here. After all, the creature is still small. He hurt himself and fought off his mother. Aslan told his parents that it would be fine, I guess. The creature seemed to recognize its master. The Duchess looked at her son and realized that, judging by the character of this boy, even if you asked something, you would not get a good answer. It was unclear whether to leave it as it was, but it didn't look like this creature would bring harm to Roel. Although it was a ferocious beast, it didn't hunt humans. Events developed in such a way that soon the protagonist will have to learn the secret of the Hickerel family. The protagonist named her little monster with the name Van. Now they could walk together, and the girl was glad that the wound on the animal's body had healed, although it was quite serious. Now this Wolfie was so healthy and full of vigor that it surprised even the doctor. Roel brought him into the forest to bring him back, but he would not leave. The protagonist told the creature it was time for him to go home. No matter how many times they tried, Van wouldn't leave the girl, so eventually they had to take him back to the castle. When Wolfman found himself back at the manor, he watched the Duchess and Dahlia practicing from the balcony. The Duchess was yelling at her youngest son to get up and continue training, since he himself said he wanted to go hunting faster, and he was no good with those skills. Mom wanted her son to realize his weakness. Serena explained to Dahlia that if you go hunting, you can't just sit around and do nothing. The Duchess didn't know if Sir Kaplan had spared Georgie for his mediocre efforts, but told her son that as long as she was in charge of his training, there would be no mercy. In the end, the boy simply ran away from the Duchess. Serena looked after her son and realized that it was most likely the age of transition. The Duchess also noticed that Lady Roll was watching her. Georgi sat not far from the manor in the garden on the steps and suffered, thinking that his mother knew nothing, because he had originally wanted to ask his brother to take him hunting, but his brother was not even practicing fencing with him now. Georgie thought about the fact that during meals, his older brother always sides with that girl and blamed Roel for everything. He thought that the girl had suddenly come to their house and was vying to be the wife of his toughest brother in the world. Georgie could not forgive this. The boy heard someone's footsteps and turned his head to see that Roel was walking towards him, holding her little monster in her arms. Georgi, in a gruff tone, asked the main character to get behind him. It made him angry that she was the one who had discovered him in such a state. The protagonist was telling Georgi that Van running back and forth was the reason she was running after him, and now her legs were shaking. The girl took a seat next to Aslan's little brother. The boy called the protagonist a wimp and wondered if her legs were shaking because of the usual running around the mansion. The girl admitted that she was completely weak, immediately gasping for breath and her legs shaking. Roel began to admire Georgie and said how amazing he was, that at such a young age, calmly walks and swings such a heavy sword and every day, without rest, to engage in battles. The protagonist said she couldn't even stand it for a day and gave up. The boy wondered if Roel really thought so. The protagonist repeated again how tough he was. Georgie looked at the girl and didn't understand if she was stupid or if she didn't know how to be angry. She was so small and thin like a mouse. The boy remembered that this weak girl had put herself under the books to protect him and realized that it was the stupidest idea in the world. Georgie stood up and apologized for being rude to Roel. After saying that, he immediately ran away. Early in the morning, a servant came into the bedroom to the main character, wished her a good morning, offered to have breakfast and start preparing. In fact, the girl did not sleep at all, because she was worried about the banquet. The Countess's training was not to be in vain. Roel wondered if she would be able to cope and perform well at the banquet. The servants had dressed the girl, and she was ready. A young gentleman entered the room and told Roel that he had come to escort her. The protagonist was overjoyed to see him and wished him good morning. The servants filled the carriage with various things, and the Duchess asked the girl to be careful on the road. Roel promised that everything would be all right, and she would be back soon. The Duke and his wife thought of going out for a short walk. They put the girl in the carriage, called Aslan, and told him to move out quickly. The son noticed that his parents were acting very suspiciously. When the carriage left the estate, the Duchess said that, in that case, they should also move out quietly. The other part of the family, along with Georgie, got into the carriage. Serena was glad that she could finally feel the capital air for the first time in a long time. The Duchess felt that it was somehow too much to send the young children alone anyway, so the adults should follow. Aslan watched Roel scrutinizing everything around him on the road. He turned to the girl and asked if the forest was scary for her. The protagonist admitted that, to be honest, she was a little scared. Aslan reassured his future bride and asked her not to worry so much, because no matter what happened, he would protect her. Roel smiled and believed this guy who was sitting next to her. There was a cloth lying nearby, from under which Van suddenly jumped out and started licking his mistress. No one knew or expected him to be here. The protagonist asked when he had time to hide here, and realized that he seemed to have secretly followed them. Aslan replied that there was nothing more to be done, and they would have to take him with them. Roel thanked the young lord for his kindness. The first time the protagonist rode the carriage to the ducal castle, it was scary, and everything seemed gloomy. Now everything was different. Perhaps thanks to the fact that the girl was next to the young gentleman, around was calm and beautiful. It seemed that nothing bad could happen. In the Viscountcy of Lintia, they learned that Lady Royal would be present with the young Lord Hickerel at the imperial banquet. The protagonist's foster mother was angry and called the girl a petty rat. It had already been a month since the Viscountess had sent Roel a letter. At first, she thought there might have been some mistake, so she sent it a second time, but there was no reply. The woman was angry and didn't understand how this girl dared to pretend she hadn't noticed her letter. The servant also said that a great many debts had already accumulated. The Viscountess, as a last resort, was going to go to the duchy personally. She thought it was all for the best and told her to prepare to attend the imperial banquet. Foster mother Roel smiled evilly and said that she hadn't properly trained her foster daughter and decided that she needed to meet her in person and teach her a lesson. There was a real celebration in the capital. The protagonist had not been there for a very long time, and because of the imperial banquet, the whole city seemed to be preparing for the festival. Aslan suggested that the girl get out to look around, seeing her rapturous looks. The carriage stopped, and Aslan politely gave the protagonist a hand and helped her out. The servant said they would be back at the specified time, and the young couple set off into the city. The street was extremely busy. People around them were already whispering that this carriage belonged to the Hickerel family without a doubt, because there was a picture of their coat of arms. People were discussing why they had come here and who was next to the young master. It was literally impossible to hide from the people. Aslan covered the girl with his cloak and suggested turning to a less busy street. The protagonist sighed heavily and said that she was only a little frightened, because the gazes of all the people were directed at them. Roel was clearly not used to this and apologized to Aslan. He was silent at first in response, but after a little thought, he said that she didn't need to apologize to him, and she didn't need to apologize to anyone in the future. Aslan told his future bride that if anyone made her ask for forgiveness, it was only worth telling him about it, and he would solve all issues. The guy took the protagonist's hand affectionately, and they continued their walk. Aslan asked the girl how long she would call him young master, for they were engaged. Roel called the lad by his name, and he smiled in return. The young couple turned down an alley where the Viscountess's favorite salon and perfume shop was located. Until a few months ago, she had been dragging the protagonist around all day to fulfill the role of porter. The protagonist recalled that before she left, her foster mother had given the girl instructions, and she thought for sure that some letter would come from her. The girl was very surprised that there was still no contact from the Viscountess and hoped that they wouldn't run into each other somewhere. The protagonist stopped and looked at the beautiful fan that lay on the display case. Aslan realized that the girl liked it, but she tried with all her looks to show that she did not. The girl was glad that the young gentleman was different from the Duchess, for if she had refused, Madame would have bought the fan anyway. Roel stopped at a shop she had never seen before. It was a magic shop. Aslan asked the girl in surprise if she could see that inscription. The protagonist once again looked carefully at the sign, which seemed quite ordinary to her, and said she could see what was written there. Aslan offered to go inside. It seemed to the girl that it was closed, but she managed to open the door. Van, who was sitting in her arms, jabbed at the protagonist. Aslan promised that everything would be all right. At a table nearby sat an elderly man with gray hair and beard. He was examining something with a magnifying glass. The old man fixed his glasses on his face and asked the young couple if they had come to buy a necklace. The protagonist looked at the old man in bewilderment and did not understand what necklace they were talking about. Nevertheless, Roel was very interested to have a look. The old man showed the guests a variety of necklaces and told them to choose. The girl noticed that these necklaces looked very different from those in other jewelry stores. They contained precious stones, which the protagonist had never seen until now. Suddenly, everything around them burst apart and shone with white light. Roel was frightened, but Aslan was beside her and held her tightly against him. The girl promised that she would make up for everything. The old man looked at Roel with very surprised eyes and asked where she even came from. The shopkeeper looked around and said that the place needed to be cleaned up first. The old man took a pencil and drew a circle, then took a huge wooden staff with a round stone on top of it. In one motion, everything went back to its original places. The protagonist realized that this man was a magician. It is unknown exactly when and how magic originated, but according to the history of the empire, magic was sent as a gift for people. It was extremely rare for people with a talent for magic to be born. It was truly a rarity. Since a large sum of money was needed to study magic, it was hard to find mages who weren't nobles. The main character watched with her mouth open and said how amazing it was. The old man was surprised that it was the girl's first time seeing mages. He was extremely surprised and even patted his face with his hands to make sure he was awake. He extended a finger to the girl's forehead and asked if the girl minded if he measured her magical power. Aslan covered Roel's hand with his and said, "No, you can't." He looked with his fierce red eyes at the old man, who asked to at least know the girl's name. The boy replied that it would be polite if the mage gave his name first. The old man replied that his name was Roman Athyros. There probably wasn't a single family in the empire that didn't know the county of Athyros, and that it was the family that owned the major trading companies. The mage raised his hand and stated that he had no connection to the count's family right now, and was eager to know the name of the girl who stood before him. The protagonist replied that her name was Roel Lintea. The old man guessed that, in that case, Aslan de Hikarel was standing next to the girl. A man in a robe entered the room and called out to Roman. The mage said that the time had passed very quickly and suggested that the girl talk again tomorrow. Roman struck the ground with his staff, on which a magic circle appeared. All the space around was flooded with white light, and the shop disappeared, and Roel and Aslan remained standing on the street. The guy suggested going back to the carriage. The protagonist was riding in the carriage, and Aslan saw her worried look. He asked the girl how she was feeling. Roel smiled happily and said she was fine. She asked Aslan if he had met any mages before. The boy replied that he had seen mages before, but they were very different from the man they met today. The wheel of the carriage hit a rock, and the sudden movement dropped Roel on the floor, dropping Van to the floor. The girl was held tightly by Aslan. The faces and eyes of the heroes were very close to each other. It seemed as if time had stopped. Van was jumping on Roel and drawing attention to himself. Aslan didn't like the way the little animal was behaving. The servants knocked on the carriage and announced to the young lord that they had arrived. Many servants had already gathered around. Aslan helped the girl out of the carriage and welcomed Roel into the ducal residence. Aslan looked at the protagonist and said that she must be very tired from the long trip and recommended resting today. The guy also promised to show the whole mansion tomorrow. The protagonist, without noticing it herself, showed signs of fatigue. She agreed to go rest, and the servants kindly promised to escort the lady to her room. Roel lay in the dark room. Before her eyes stood the moment when her and Aslan's faces were very close to each other. The girl reflected on the fact that a lot had happened today, and tomorrow was already a banquet. The protagonist realized that she had to try her best. Roman, whose shop the protagonist came to today, reflected on the fact that that child just touched the magic stone and the power exploded. He realized that if the girl had not had the magical power in her body, this would not have happened. The mage believed that the girl herself was a walking magic stone. He had traveled everywhere studying magic, but had never observed such a phenomenon. In order to use magic, one must necessarily have a magic stone. Magicians have been doing deep research for a long time, but they still couldn't understand how magic stones were created and the principle behind the magic power. Mages knew that the magic stones that were mined in the mines belonged to the Hikarel family. Roman had written several times requesting permission to look at one of the mines, but the duchy had never granted permission. The mage continued to ponder the young Mr. Hikarel and the girl with immense magical power. The apprentice reminded Roman that he must attend the imperial banquet tomorrow. Even though Roman hates noble culture, including banquets, but he was going to attend there anyway. The apprentice asked if the mage was going to be there on behalf of Athyros County. The old man scratched his beard and said that he would be there as the chief mage of the empire. The mage's apprentice was very surprised by his mentor's behavior. In the morning, the protagonist woke up to her hand being licked by Van. Roel was very worried about her little friend because he was very scared after going to that magic shop. Even after arriving at the mansion, he still couldn't relax. Roel was incredibly relieved that Van was all right. Turning her head, she saw a huge mountain of gifts. The maid entered the bedroom at that moment, wished good morning, and brought an hour for the mistress. The protagonist asked the maid what the boxes were. Linda replied that they were all gifts addressed to her. Roel was shocked. After examining the boxes, she assumed it was a mistake as it didn't even say who they were from. The girl asked to send these gifts back, but the servants insisted that all this was addressed specifically to Lady Roel. The protagonist tried to understand how it was so, and Linda offered the girl to open them. Among the gifts, the protagonist saw the things she had been eyeing when she and Aslan were walking around the capital. The servant pulled the girl by the shoulder and said that the gifts could be examined in the evening, and now it was time to start preparing for the banquet. Linda told the protagonist that if they started now, they would definitely not be late. They had to choose the dress that Roel would wear to the banquet, pick out jewelry and shoes and makeup. The servants rubbed their palms together and said that it was time to start active preparations. The protagonist was given to try on different images. Natural makeup was applied. What seemed to be necklaces were offered to choose from those given by the Duchess. Roel realized how difficult it was to dress up. All the preparations were finished, and Lady Roel's image was put together. The protagonist looked out the window and saw that the sun was already setting. The girl was called and told that it was time to come down. Still, one question bothered the protagonist very much. She was worried that her adoptive mother, Viscountess Lintea, might show up at the banquet. Going down the steps, the girl saw Aslan. Her gaze was literally fixed on the boy. Aslan asked the girl why she was looking at him like that. Roel answered bluntly that he was very handsome. The guy got embarrassed and laughed. He thanked the main character for the compliment. Aslan gently took Roel's hand and said that she looked even more beautiful. There was a beautiful relationship between this young couple. Viscountess Lintea, however, arrived at the imperial palace. She walked amongst the crowd and noticed these people looking at her over the top. The woman thought about the fact that she was now of a different class than these empty-headed people who only had rank. The Viscountess thought that now she had a purse from which money flowed, and now she could stand shoulder to shoulder with high-ranking nobles who had power and wealth. The adoptive mother of the protagonist came not alone, but with her son. She was telling the boy that they needed to find Roel now. The son pointed his finger somewhere and asked to look. Huge gold-colored doors opened. At the side stood knights and bowed. Young Mr. Hickerel and his fiancée Lady Roel entered. The Viscountess noticed the coat of arms. It was exactly the Hickerel family. The woman could not believe that that handsome fellow was the young Mr. Hickerel, for she had been told that he was disfigured and crippled. The Viscountess found it hard to believe, and she realized that if it was really him, Roel must be nearby. From Aslan's shadow, the protagonist appeared. The Viscountess and her son stood there with their mouths open. The protagonist walked and looked around. It was the first time she had seen such a lavish banquet hall. The people at the event were whispering and gawking at young Mr. Hickerel and his rumored and gossiped bride like this. Roel looked at Aslan. He was not nervous at all and seemed calm. Thanks to her fiancé's calmness, the protagonist also calmed down. Aslan held out a glass of wine to Roel. The girl didn't know if she could drink it, but the guy assured her it was fine. It was a punch that didn't contain alcohol. The protagonist took a sip from the glass and glowed with happiness because it was incredibly delicious. Aslan looked at Roel affectionately. It was a time to recover, a world where it was just the two of them. A woman in a red dress approached the protagonists. She bowed and said she was honored to meet the young Master Hickerel. Her name was Melia Labiant. Roel remembered that this woman was from Labianth County, a lady from a large noble family that Countess Cobelia had told her about in class. The protagonist realized that she needed to say hello politely somehow. Roel pronounced that she was glad to meet the lady from Labianth County, but the girl completely ignored her words. Melia turned to the young gentleman again, but he ignored, turned to Roel and offered to go get something to eat. The girl was furious and screamed that the young master was ignoring her. Aslan turned around and pointed out to Melia that she had ignored his fiancé's greeting. The girl had to rectify the situation and greeted Roel Lintea.